I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would empty our bank accounts and disappear in the night. But I also never thought my husband of 40 years would try to kill me. The fall down our mahogany staircase lasted only seconds. But in those moments, suspended between flight and impact, my entire life flashed before my eyes. Not in the way people describe near-death experiences. There was nothing beautiful or profound about it. Instead, I saw with perfect clarity all the warning signs I'd spent decades ignoring. Sterling's handprint was still burning on my shoulder when I landed. The crack of my hip against the marble floor echoed through our Connecticut mansion, followed by an eerie silence. I remember looking up at him, standing at the top of the stairs, his face twisted with a rage I'd seen building for years. He didn't rush down to help me. He just stood there, watching, as if waiting to see if he'd finish the job. "Octavia, you clumsy fool," he called down, his voice unnervingly calm. "You really should be more careful at your age." That was 3 weeks ago. Now I sit in a modest motel room 50 miles from anywhere Sterling would think to look, a new burner phone in my hand and $2.7 million distributed across 4 offshore accounts that he doesn't know exist. My bruised body aches as I shift on the bed, but the pain reminds me I'm alive, that I've survived. I was 62 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was truly free. The doctors at the emergency room had exchanged knowing glances when Sterling explained how his confused wife had tragically misstepped. I caught their skepticism, the silent communication that passed between them. It wasn't the first time medical professionals had suspected something, but Sterling was Sterling Bellamy, pharmaceutical executive turned philanthropist, the man who donated the new wing to this very hospital. His concerned husband act was flawless. Solicitous, grief-stricken, attentive. Only I could see the cold calculation behind his eyes when we were alone, the unspoken threat. "No one will believe you over me." He wasn't wrong. He'd spent decades ensuring that would be the case. Gradually isolating me from friends, controlling our finances, convincing our daughter Zara that her mother was emotionally unstable. The perfect long game. I spent 3 days in that hospital bed, in excruciating pain from 3 broken ribs, a fractured hip, and a concussion. Yet those 3 days gave me something precious. Time to think without Sterling hovering over my every move. The young night nurse, Delilah, was the only one who dared to slip me a domestic violence pamphlet. "Just in case," she whispered, tucking it beneath my water cup when Sterling stepped out to take a call. "The police can't do much without your statement. But there are people who can help." I almost laughed. Help against Sterling Bellamy? The man who golfed with judges and had the district attorney on speed dial? The man who had systematically convinced our social circle that I was becoming forgetful and emotionally erratic in my old age? No, traditional help wasn't an option for me. But as I lay there, watching Sterling charm every person who entered my room while simultaneously squeezing my hand just hard enough to cause pain without leaving marks, a different solution began forming in my mind. When they discharged me to Sterling's excellent care, I was already making mental calculations. Sterling insisted I take my pain medication on schedule. It made me drowsy, compliant, easier to manage as he installed me in our guest bedroom. To recover more comfortably, he explained. What he really meant was he wanted me on the first floor, where I couldn't access our offices or his files, where he could monitor my phone calls and visitors. Each night, I'd pretend to swallow my pills, tucking them instead beneath my tongue and later into a tissue. Each day, I'd perform the role of grateful, fragile wife, while my mind worked with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The fall had knocked something loose in me, not just physically, but mentally. The fog of doubt and self-recrimination that Sterling had cultivated over decades was lifting. I remembered I had been somebody before I was Sterling Bellamy's wife. I had been Octavia Reed, graduated summa cum laude from Wellesley, with a promising future in art curation before Sterling's ambitions became our only priority. On the 6th day home, when Sterling left for his monthly board meeting that I knew would last hours, I hobbled to his office despite the searing pain in my hip. I knew his passwords. Not because he trusted me, but because he was arrogant enough to believe I would never dare use them. The password to his computer was still our daughter's birthday, combined with his college football jersey number. Predictable for a man who viewed his family as extensions of himself rather than as people. I didn't waste time on his emails or personal files. I went straight to our financial records. Sterling had always protected me from the burden of our finances, giving me an allowance that grew more restrictive each year. But before he'd fully established his control, I'd been the one balancing our accounts. I knew how to navigate banking systems. What I found confirmed my suspicions. A substantial fortune hidden even from our tax returns, accounts I'd never seen, investments I'd never approved. And something else, a separate apartment in New York City, paid for monthly from our joint funds, and regular payments to someone named Cassandra Worth. The other woman wasn't a surprise. The surprise was that I felt nothing, no hurt, no betrayal, just another confirmation that my life with Sterling had been built on lies. It took me just 2 hours to set my plan in motion. I didn't take everything. That would trigger immediate alerts. Instead, I siphoned amounts just under the reporting thresholds to the accounts I'd established using an identity Sterling didn't know about. An identity I'd been quietly creating over the past 5 years, whenever the bruises became too difficult to hide with makeup and I started to fear for my life. I worked methodically, my hands steady despite the pain radiating through my body. By the time I heard Sterling's car in the driveway, all traces of my activities were erased from his computer, and I was back in the guest bed, pretending to sleep off my medication. That night, as Sterling checked on me before retiring to the master bedroom upstairs, he stroked my hair with a tenderness that once would have made my heart leap. Now it made my skin crawl. "You know I love you, Octavia," he murmured. "Everything I do is for us, for our legacy." I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even. He lingered a moment longer, then added in a whisper that chilled me to my core, "It's a shame you've become such a liability." In that moment, I knew my suspicions were correct. The stares hadn't been an impulsive act of rage. They had been a calculation, one that had failed. I wouldn't give him a second chance to succeed. I waited 3 more days, playing the role of compliant invalid while finalizing my preparations. I arranged for a car service using my new identity's credit card. I packed only what I could fit into one suitcase, nothing valuable or recognizable. I wrote a letter to Zara that I knew she might never believe, but that I needed to write anyway, and scheduled it for delivery 1 month after my disappearance. The hardest part was accepting that I might never see my daughter again. Sterling had poisoned our relationship years ago, painting me as the emotionally manipulative parent while positioning himself as the stable protector. Zara, desperate for paternal approval, had gradually pulled away from me. Our conversations had become surface level, our relationship a hollow shell of what it once had been. My heart broke, knowing she would likely believe whatever story Sterling concocted about my disappearance. On the night I chose to leave, Sterling had taken his sleeping pill as usual. He'd been working longer hours lately, coming home tense and distracted. I suspected he was preparing for a second, more successful accident for his inconvenient wife. I waited until his breathing deepened into the heavy rhythm of drugged sleep before slipping from the guest room. My body protested each movement, but adrenaline dulled the pain. I changed into nondescript clothes, applied makeup to cover the lingering bruises on my face, and donned a wig I'd ordered online and had delivered to an Amazon locker miles from our home. I took one last look at the mansion that had been my gilded cage for 4 decades. The perfect art on the walls, the immaculate furniture that I'd never been allowed to choose, the photographs displaying our perfect family, all of it curated to project an image that had never been real. I didn't feel regret as I stepped out into the cool night air. I felt like I was taking my first full breath in 40 years. The car was waiting at the end of our long driveway, headlights off as instructed. The driver asked no questions when I gave him an address for a bus station 2 towns over. From there, I would take a series of buses and trains, a deliberately convoluted route that would be nearly impossible to track. As we pulled away, I resisted the urge to look back. Looking back was what had kept me trapped for decades. The memories of good times that weren't really good, just less awful. The hope that things would change. The fear that no one would believe me. Sterling would wake up to find me gone, along with a carefully calculated amount of money, enough to infuriate him, but not enough to financially cripple him. His rage would be all-consuming. He would call the police, report me missing or unstable or vindictive. He would tell our friends and Zara that the fall had affected my mind, that I was confused, that he was worried sick about my safety. But for the first time since I'd said I do to a charming, ambitious man at 22, I was beyond his reach. I wasn't naive. I knew Sterling wouldn't let me go easily, not me, and certainly not his money. He would use every resource at his disposal to find me, which is why my disappearance was just phase 1 of my plan. Phase 2 would require me to become someone Sterling would never recognize, not just in name and appearance, but in spirit. The meek, accommodating Octavia Bellamy would cease to exist. In her place would emerge the woman I might have been had I never met him. I had no illusions that this would be easy. I was a 62-year-old woman with a recently broken hip, no employment history for the past 40 years, and limited connections outside of Sterling's sphere of influence. But I also had something I hadn't possessed in decades: absolute clarity of purpose. As the car merged onto the highway, taking me toward an uncertain future, I felt something unexpected bloom in my chest. Not fear, though that was certainly present. Not anger, though that simmered beneath the surface. It was hope, fragile and tentative, but unmistakably real. I had no idea where I would ultimately settle, who I would become, or if I would ever feel truly safe again. But for the first time in 40 years, those decisions were mine alone to make. By the time Sterling Bellamy realized the magnitude of what I'd done, I intended to be nothing more than a ghost, a cautionary tale he would never fully understand. After all, he had never really seen me, not the real me. It seemed fitting that the real me would be the one to finally bring him down. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Long night, ma'am?" I smiled, surprising myself with how genuine it felt. "No," I replied. "Actually, it's a new day." As the distance between me and my former life grew, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth I'd been denying for far too long. Sterling's attempt to kill me had saved my life. In pushing me down those stairs, he had inadvertently pushed me toward freedom. And this time, I wasn't going to waste it. The coastal town of Harborview, Maine, wasn't on any tourist maps. That's precisely why I chose it. The harsh winter winds whipped off the Atlantic as I stepped off the local bus, my newly dyed silver hair tucked under a plain woolen hat. 6 weeks had passed since my escape, and each mile between Sterling and me felt like another breath of freedom. In those 6 weeks, I'd stayed constantly on the move. Buses, cheap motels, careful cash transactions. I'd changed my appearance, cut my expensively maintained caramel hair into a practical bob, and let the silver shine through, shed 20 pounds from my already slim frame due to stress and constant vigilance, exchanged designer clothing for practical, forgettable pieces from department stores. I'd practiced walking differently, speaking with a slightly different accent, introducing myself with my new name, Eleanor Winters. The pain in my hip had become a constant companion, a dull throb that worsened in cold weather. The doctors had recommended physical therapy, but that would have required insurance, medical records, questions I couldn't answer. Instead, I relied on over-the-counter painkillers and determination, forcing myself to walk a little farther each day to rebuild my strength. Sterling had broken my body, but I refused to let him break my resolve. I had done my research meticulously. Harborview was small enough to be overlooked, but large enough that a newcomer wouldn't draw undue attention. The town had suffered economic decline when the fishing industry collapsed, meaning rental properties were affordable and available. Most importantly, it was a place Sterling would never think to look. He despised small towns, cold weather, and anything he deemed provincial. The rental agent, a ruddy-faced man named Bert, barely glanced at my falsified documents when I paid 3 months' rent in cash for the small cottage overlooking the harbor. "Place has been empty 2 years, he explained, handing me the keys. "Owner's some rich fella from Boston who never comes up anymore. Just wants it occupied so it don't fall apart." The cottage was nothing like the mansions and luxury condos I'd lived in with Sterling. It was small, drafty, with outdated appliances and furniture that had seen better days. But it had a breathtaking view of the harbor, walls lined with bookshelves, and most importantly, it was mine, chosen by me, paid for by me, a space where Sterling's presence had never been. That first night, I sat on the worn sofa with a cup of tea, watching the fishing boats return to harbor as the sun set. The silence was profound after weeks of constant movement. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully process what had happened, what I had done, and what lay ahead. The tears came unexpectedly, not tears of regret or fear, but of mourning for 40 years lost, for the woman I might have been, for the relationship with my daughter that Sterling had systematically destroyed. I cried until I had nothing left, then fell asleep on the sofa, emotionally exhausted, but oddly unburdened. Morning brought clarity and purpose. I couldn't change the past, but I could build a future, however limited or temporary it might be. I had no illusions that Sterling would ever stop looking for me. His pride and need for control wouldn't allow it. But I could create something meaningful in whatever time I had before he found me. I established a routine. Each morning, I would walk along the harbor, pushing my healing body a little further each day. Then I would visit the local library, using their computers to carefully check news from Connecticut, searching for any mention of my disappearance. I was never mentioned by name in the articles I found, just vague references to the missing wife of prominent businessman Sterling Bellamy. The articles painted him as the concerned husband, cooperating with authorities, offering a substantial reward for information. 3 weeks into my new life, I found what I had been expecting. Sterling had hired Rowan Corvus, a private investigator known for finding people who didn't want to be found. The society page photo showed them shaking hands at some charity function, Sterling's expression appropriately grave, Corvus watchful and intense. I memorized Corvus's face, knowing it was more likely to appear in Harborview than Sterling's. I needed to establish myself in the community, not just for cover, but for my own sanity. Isolation had been one of Sterling's most effective tools. I wouldn't do his work for him by isolating myself now. The local bookstore, Tidewater Books, became my sanctuary. It was small but well curated, with comfortable chairs and the perpetual smell of fresh coffee. The owner, Maeve Lockhart, was about my age with wild gray curls and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to look straight through pretense. She didn't ask questions when I spent hours browsing, occasionally purchasing a book, despite clearly being on a budget. One rainy afternoon, when the store was empty except for me, she placed a cup of tea on the table beside my chair. "You're new to town," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, tension immediately tightening my shoulders. Had I been found already? "Relax," Maeve said, noting my reaction. "Everyone knows everyone here. A new face stands out, especially one that reads Russian literature in the original language." I glanced down at the Dostoevsky in my hands, cursing my carelessness. I'd spent years studying Russian literature before meeting Sterling. It was one of the few intellectual pursuits he hadn't managed to stamp out completely, though he'd mocked it as pretentious and useless. "My mother was Russian," I explained, the lie coming easily. "It reminds me of her." Maeve nodded, not pushing further. "I'm short-handed since my assistant moved to Portland. Need any work? Pay's not great, but employee discount on books is substantial." The offer caught me off guard. I hadn't considered employment. My offshore accounts would sustain me for years if I lived modestly. But the prospect of meaningful work, of regular human interaction that wasn't colored by Sterling's influence, was suddenly appealing. "I'd like that," I heard myself say. Working at Tidewater Books gave structure to my days and a legitimate reason for my presence in Harborview. Maeve was a fair employer and an even better friend, though I kept her at arm's length, conscious of the danger my friendship could pose to anyone if Sterling tracked me down. I learned the rhythms of the small coastal town, the fishermen who stopped in for coffee and conversation before dawn, the summer residents who trickled in as the weather warmed, looking for beach reads and local history, the high school students who used the shop as a quiet place to study away from chaotic homes. I rented a post office box under my new name and began the process of creating a more solid identity. With careful planning and the right contacts, paid handsomely from my offshore accounts, Eleanor Winters gained a driver's license, social security number, and credit history. I kept my transactions small and inconspicuous, always aware that financial patterns could be traced. My cottage slowly transformed from a temporary shelter to a home. I planted a small garden, painted the walls in colors I chose, filled the bookshelves with volumes that reflected my tastes rather than what would impress Sterling's colleagues. I adopted an elderly cat from the local shelter, a one-eyed orange tabby that the shelter worker said had been overlooked for years. We recognized something in each other, survivors who had been underestimated. 5 months into my new life, I received my first warning. I was helping a customer find a particular nautical history book when I glanced up and saw a familiar face through the store window. Not Sterling, but his golf partner, Judge Wilson, strolling down the main street with his wife. They were clearly summer tourists, probably staying at one of the bed and breakfasts further up the coast. My blood ran cold. I excused myself and retreated to the stockroom, heart pounding. It could be coincidence. Maine was a popular summer destination for wealthy New Englanders. But coincidence or not, it was a stark reminder that my safety was tenuous. I waited until they passed, then told Maeve I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early. I spent the evening packing an emergency bag, cash, new identity documents, essential medications. If I needed to run again, I would be ready. The Wilsons left town 2 days later without entering the bookstore. I allowed myself to breathe again, but the incident sharpened my vigilance. I began to vary my routes through town, to wear hats and scarves that partially obscured my face, to limit my time in public places where tourists congregated. As summer faded into fall, I felt a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the close call with the Wilsons. It was the increasing number of news articles about my disappearance, the mention of federal authorities becoming involved due to the significant financial component, the growing reward for information. Sterling was escalating his search, his resources far outstripping my ability to hide indefinitely. I found myself checking the locks repeatedly at night, startling at unexpected sounds, scanning every unfamiliar face for signs of threat. The nightmares returned. Sterling at the top of the stairs, watching impassively as I fell. Except in these dreams, I never hit bottom, just kept falling endlessly while he grew smaller above me. My neighbor, Thaddeus Whitaker, noticed my declining mental state during our occasional shared walks along the harbor. He was a retired history professor, a widower with kind eyes and a careful manner that never made me feel crowded or questioned. He'd been one of the first locals to welcome me, bringing over homemade sourdough bread and offering to help with household repairs when he noticed my limp. "The ocean helps," he said one evening, as we watched the sunset from the small public pier. "That's why I moved here after Helen died. There's something about its constancy, always changing on the surface, but fundamentally the same underneath. Reminds me that whatever chaos we're experiencing is temporary." I didn't respond directly, but found myself explaining the basics of my situation. A carefully edited version that mentioned an abusive husband I'd fled, but none of the specifics that could identify me. Thaddeus listened without interruption, his weathered face compassionate, but not pitying. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My Helen stayed with her first husband for 12 years before finding the courage to leave," he finally said. "She always said the hardest part wasn't the leaving, it was believing she deserved better." His words struck a chord. Despite my escape, despite the new life I was building, part of me still carried Sterling's voice in my head, telling me I was nothing without him, that I was selfish, unstable, unworthy. 40 years of psychological conditioning couldn't be undone in a few months. "How did she silence his voice?" I asked, not needing to explain what I meant. Thaddeus smiled sadly. "She didn't. Not completely. But she built a chorus of other voices around it, friends, experiences, achievements that spoke louder than his criticism. Eventually, his voice became just a whisper she could recognize and dismiss." That night, I made a decision. If I couldn't outrun Sterling forever, and realistically, I knew I couldn't, then I needed to prepare to confront him. Not physically, but legally. I needed evidence of his financial crimes, his abuse, his affair. I needed allies and resources beyond what I currently possessed. I contacted Fletcher Devereaux, the lawyer whose information I'd been given through a domestic violence support forum I'd discreetly joined online. He specialized in high-conflict divorces involving wealthy, powerful men. Our initial consultation was conducted through encrypted messaging, with me providing only the barest details of my situation. "What you're describing is complex, but not impossible," he wrote. "However, timing and evidence are crucial. If you move too soon, without sufficient documentation, you risk not just losing your case, but potentially your freedom and safety. He outlined what I would need: financial records showing Sterling's hidden accounts and tax evasion, medical records documenting my injuries over the years, testimonies from witnesses to his abuse or its aftermath, evidence of his affair and any other criminal or unethical behavior that would damage his carefully constructed public image. Some of this evidence I already had, hidden in encrypted files. Some I would need to obtain through riskier means. Fletcher's final message was sobering. "Mrs. Bellamy, you should understand that men like your husband rarely lose gracefully. If you proceed, you must be prepared for him to use every resource at his disposal to destroy you. The question isn't whether you can win, it's whether you can survive winning." As I closed the encrypted messaging app, I was surprised to find my hands were steady. 6 months ago, such a warning would have paralyzed me with fear. Now, it only strengthened my resolve. I had spent 40 years being Sterling Bellamy's victim. I refused to spend what remained of my life as his fugitive. Fall deepened into winter. The tourists departed, leaving Harborview to its year-round residents. The bookstore hours shortened, but the regular customers became more likely to linger, treating the space as a community haven against the harsh weather. I continued gathering evidence, carefully documenting my memories of specific incidents of abuse, dates when Sterling had made questionable financial transactions, names of household staff who might have witnessed his behavior. I created a secure digital archive, accessible only with multiple layers of authentication, with copies stored on servers outside the United States. One bitterly cold January morning, as I opened the bookstore, a young woman entered, stamping snow from her boots. Her face was vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place her. She browsed briefly, then approached the counter with a travel guide to coastal Maine. "Just this, please," she said, then paused, studying my face. "You know, you remind me of someone." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral as I rang up her purchase. "I have one of those faces," I replied lightly. She shook her head. "No, it's specific. You look like my friend's mother, Octavia Bellamy. She went missing about 8 months ago." I nearly dropped the book. The young woman was Zara's college roommate. I'd met her briefly at Zara's graduation, then again at a holiday party years later. She had been a gangly teenager then. Now she was a poised young professional. Of all the people who might have recognized me, she was relatively harmless, but the encounter shook me deeply. "I'm sorry about your friend's mother," I said, handing her the bagged book. "I hope she's found safely." The young woman nodded, still looking at me curiously. "The whole situation is bizarre. Mr. Bellamy has been on the news offering this huge reward, but Zara, my friend, she says something feels off about the whole thing. She says her mom had been acting strange for months before she disappeared." I struggled to maintain my composure. "That sounds very difficult for your friend." "Yeah. Anyway, sorry to bother you with this. You just really look like her, except for the hair and—" She gestured vaguely at my now thinner frame. "Have a good day." After she left, I closed the store early, citing a migraine to Maeve. I returned to my cottage and spent hours pacing, torn between elation at hearing that Zara had doubts about her father's story and terror that my cover had been blown. I pulled out the burner phone I kept for emergencies and dialed Fletcher's number. "We may need to accelerate our timeline," I told him when he answered. "I've been recognized." The morning after being recognized, I woke before dawn, my mind racing with contingency plans. Fletcher had advised against immediate flight. "Running again makes you look guilty," he'd explained. "Stay alert, but stay put unless there's concrete evidence she's reported the sighting." I followed his advice, though every instinct screamed at me to flee. I maintained my routine, working at the bookstore, taking my evening walks with Thaddeus, all while monitoring news from Connecticut for any mention of a potential sighting. Nothing appeared. Either Zara's friend hadn't made the connection strongly enough to report it, or she had reported it, and Sterling was pursuing the lead quietly. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. I began sleeping with my emergency bag beside my bed. I researched bus schedules to Canada. I withdrew additional cash in small amounts from different ATMs in neighboring towns. I was preparing for inevitable discovery while desperately hoping it wouldn't come. 2 weeks after the encounter, Fletcher called with news that shifted everything. "Sterling's being investigated by the SEC," he said without preamble. "Insider trading, tax evasion, possible connections to offshore accounts in the Caymans. This changes our strategy completely. The revelation stunned me. Sterling had always been careful with his financial crimes, meticulous about covering his tracks. For the SEC to launch an investigation, someone close to him must have provided evidence. Someone with intimate knowledge of his business dealings. Who reported him? I asked. That's the interesting part, Fletcher replied. According to my source, it was triggered by an anonymous package of documents sent to the Enforcement Division. Very detailed, very damning. The kind of documentation only someone with insider access would have. I thought of Cassandra Worth, Sterling's mistress. Perhaps she had tired of waiting for him to leave me, not knowing I had already gone. Or perhaps one of his business associates had turned on him. Sterling had a talent for creating enemies, even among his allies. What does this mean for me? I asked. It means Sterling is now fighting a war on two fronts, looking for you and defending himself against federal charges. His resources will be divided, his attention split. More importantly, it means his public image is cracking. If we move now, while he's vulnerable, your chances improve significantly. I considered this. Sterling's sterling reputation had always been his most valuable asset and his strongest shield. If that was tarnishing, the power dynamic between us would shift dramatically. What do you recommend? We accelerate our timeline. I file the divorce papers naming his abuse, his affair, his financial crimes. We leak strategic details to select media outlets. We force him to fight publicly rather than hunt you quietly. It was aggressive, risky, and potentially our best opportunity. Sterling thrived in shadows and backroom deals. Dragging him into the light might be the one thing he wasn't prepared to counter. Do it, I said. The next morning, Fletcher filed divorce papers in Connecticut on my behalf, citing decades of physical and emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and attempted murder. By afternoon, the story had been picked up by several news outlets. By evening, it was national news. Missing wife of prominent businessman files for divorce, alleges attempted murder. I watched the coverage from my cottage, a surreal experience seeing my name in headlines, hearing commentators discuss my case as if they knew anything about my life. Sterling issued a statement through his lawyer expressing deep concern for his mentally unstable wife and claiming that her false allegations were the product of confusion resulting from her fall. It was exactly the response I had expected. Sterling would never admit wrongdoing. He would simply shift the narrative to make me the villain. But there was a desperation to his statement that hadn't been present in his earlier public comments about my disappearance. The SEC investigation had rattled him. Maeve noticed the change in my demeanor when I arrived at the bookstore the next day. You seem different, she observed as we unpacked a shipment of new releases. Less hunted. I managed a small smile. Maybe I'm finally starting to believe I deserve peace. She nodded, not pushing for details she knew I wouldn't provide. That was Maeve's gift, knowing when to probe and when to allow silence. The strategy Fletcher and I had developed was working. Sterling was being forced to defend himself publicly against both my allegations and the SEC investigation. His carefully cultivated image was unraveling thread by thread. Former household staff came forward with accounts of his volatile temper. Business associates distanced themselves, suddenly concerned about patterns they had conveniently overlooked for years. Most surprising was the statement from our family doctor, who confirmed treating me for suspicious injuries over the years. He claimed patient confidentiality had prevented him from reporting his concerns, though I knew the truth was more complex. Sterling's donations to the hospital had bought the doctor's silence until it became more dangerous to remain quiet than to speak up. 3 days after the divorce filing made headlines, I received a text on my emergency phone from an unknown number. We need to talk. Zed, my daughter. My heart raced as I stared at those 4 words. How had she obtained this number? Only Fletcher had it. Was it really Zara? Or was it Sterling trying to locate me? I showed the message to Fletcher during our encrypted video call that evening. It's legitimate, he confirmed. Zara came to my office yesterday. She was distressed by the allegations in the divorce filing. She wants to hear your side directly. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. I had dreamed of reconnecting with my daughter, but not like this, not with the weight of such ugly truths between us. Is it safe? I asked. We can arrange a secure call. No location tracking, no recording devices. But Octavia? Fletcher's voice softened. You should prepare yourself. She's confused and angry. Sterling has been her primary influence for years. This won't be an easy conversation. The call was scheduled for the following evening. I spent the intervening hours in a state of nervous anticipation, rehearsing what to say, how to explain my actions without overwhelming Zara with the full horror of my marriage to her father. When the phone finally rang, my hand trembled as I answered. Mom? Zara's voice was tight, controlled, so like her father's professional tone that it sent a chill through me. Yes, sweetheart, it's me. Tears filled my eyes at the sound of her voice. Are you safe? The question surprised me. I had expected accusations, not concern. Yes, I'm safe. Good. She paused. Did Dad really push you down the stairs? The directness of the question caught me off guard. Yes, I answered simply. There was no gentle way to confirm such a truth. Zara's breath hitched audibly. Why didn't you tell me? All these years, why didn't you say something? It was the question I had dreaded most because the answer implicated her father's manipulation of us both. He made sure I couldn't, I explained carefully. He controlled who I spoke to, monitored my calls, and he worked very hard to make sure you wouldn't believe me if I tried. By making me think you were emotionally unstable. It wasn't a question. The episodes he said you had when I was too young to remember, the medications he said you needed but refused to take. Yes, I whispered. Dad said you stole money when you left. Millions. I took a deep breath. I took what was rightfully mine after 40 years of marriage. Money I helped him earn, investments I helped him choose. And yes, I took it to survive because I knew he would use financial control to force me back if I didn't. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and revelations. I found something, Zara finally said, her voice hesitant. After the SEC investigation started, I was going through old files in his home office, trying to understand what was happening. There was a hidden compartment in his desk. Inside was a flash drive with copies of all his financial records, the real ones, not the versions he showed the IRS. My pulse quickened. What did you do with it? I made a copy and gave the original to his lawyer, Zara said. I told Dad I found it and thought his attorney should have it for the investigation. He was grateful. He doesn't know I kept a copy. Clever girl. She had given herself plausible deniability while preserving evidence. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't know what to believe anymore, Zara admitted, her composure finally cracking. The father I thought I knew wouldn't do the things you're claiming. But the father I thought I knew also wouldn't be under investigation for financial fraud. I need to understand what's real. I can tell you my truth, I offered. I can't make you believe it, but I can promise I never wanted to leave you. Only him. Our conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. I shared selective details of Sterling's abuse, enough to explain my actions without traumatizing her with the worst of it. She asked pointed, sometimes skeptical questions. She cried when I described how Sterling had gradually alienated her from me, rewriting our family history to cast himself as the stable parent and me as the unpredictable one. I have these memories of you being cold, distant, she confessed. But now I'm questioning if that's even true, or if that's just how he framed every interaction for me. I made mistakes, I acknowledged. There were times I withdrew because it was safer than risking his anger. Times I was distant because I was in pain or afraid. But I have never, ever stopped loving you, Zara. You need to know that. By the end of the call, nothing was resolved, but a door had been opened. Zara promised to send the copied financial records to Fletcher securely. She couldn't bring herself to cut ties with her father, which I understood. Despite everything, he was still her parent. But she agreed to meet with me in person when it was safe, to continue rebuilding what Sterling had worked so hard to destroy. After we hung up, I sat in my darkened cottage, emotionally drained but lighter than I had felt in months. The conversation with Zara had been painful but necessary. The first step toward healing a relationship I had feared was permanently broken. The financial records Zara provided proved invaluable. They documented years of tax fraud, hidden assets, bribes disguised as consulting fees, and numerous offshore accounts beyond the ones I had discovered. Fletcher immediately forwarded the evidence to the SEC investigators, strengthening their case against Sterling exponentially. The walls were closing in on Sterling Bellamy. His reputation was in tatters, his financial empire under scrutiny, his own daughter beginning to question his narrative. But I knew better than to underestimate him. Cornered predators are at their most dangerous. Sure enough, Sterling's counterattack came swiftly and brutally. 3 days after my conversation with Zara, a private investigator showed up in Harborview, flashing my photograph in local businesses, claiming to be working on behalf of a concerned family searching for their mentally ill relative. Maeve called me immediately after he left the bookstore. "Some guy in an expensive suit was just here looking for you," she said. "Not by your current name. He called you Octavia Bellamy. Said you were delusional and had emptied your family's accounts before disappearing." My blood ran cold. "Did you tell him anything?" "Of course not." Maeve sounded offended at the suggestion. "Told him I'd never heard the name and hadn't seen anyone matching your description. But Ellie, or Octavia, or whoever you are, he had recent photos of you, walking on the harbor, entering the cottage. He's been watching you." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. The investigator had found me, which meant Sterling knew exactly where I was. My carefully constructed sanctuary had been compromised. I called Fletcher, who confirmed my worst fears. "It's Rowan Corvus," he said grimly. "Sterling's hired the best. And he's escalating. He's filed a countersuit claiming you're mentally incompetent and stole company funds. He's seeking an emergency conservatorship over your finances and medical decisions." The strategy was clear. If Sterling could have me declared mentally incompetent, everything I'd said about his abuse would be dismissed as delusion. The financial records Zara had provided would be attributed to my theft, rather than his crimes. He would regain control of the money I'd taken, and more importantly, regain control of me. "What do we do?" I asked. "We have 2 options," Fletcher replied. "You can run again, new identity, new location, start over. Or we can make a stand. Counter his narrative directly, go public with your story before he can control it completely." Both options terrified me. Running meant abandoning the life I'd built in Harborview, the friends who had helped me rediscover my worth, the progress I'd made in reconnecting with Zara. But standing my ground meant confronting Sterling directly, something I hadn't done in 40 years of marriage. "If I go public," I said slowly, "I become a target. Not just for Sterling, but for public opinion, for media scrutiny. Yes," Fletcher didn't sugarcoat it, "but you also take control of the narrative. Right now, Sterling is defining you as unstable, criminal, deceptive. You have the opportunity to define yourself." I thought of all the times Sterling had spoken for me, over me, about me, controlling how the world perceived me until I began to doubt my own reality. The prospect of reclaiming my voice was both terrifying and exhilarating. What would going public look like? An exclusive interview with a respected journalist. We share evidence of the abuse, the financial crimes, the calculated way Sterling isolated you. We emphasize your rationality, your courage in escaping, your right to financial security after decades of marriage. It would mean exposing the darkest aspects of my life to public consumption. It would mean reliving traumas I'd spent months trying to process. But it would also mean standing in my truth, refusing to be silenced or erased any longer. "Find the journalist," I said. "I'll do it." The interview was arranged with Catherine Lowell, a veteran investigative reporter known for her unflinching coverage of domestic violence among the elite. Fletcher secured a neutral location, a hotel suite in Portland, with private security he personally vetted. I spent the days before the interview preparing, not just emotionally, but practically. I gathered medical records documenting my injuries over the years. I compiled financial statements showing how Sterling had gradually restricted my access to our joint assets. I wrote out a timeline of the escalating abuse, forcing myself to revisit memories I had long suppressed. The night before the interview, Thaddeus insisted on driving me to Portland, concerned about my safety, traveling alone with Corvus, potentially tracking my movements. "I won't intrude on your privacy," he assured me as we drove along the dark coastal road. "But I couldn't bear the thought of you facing this journey alone. His quiet support meant more than I could express. We had never defined our relationship beyond friendship, both carrying too much history to rush into romance, but his steady presence had become essential to my healing. "Thank you," I said simply, "for believing me without proof, for seeing me when I was trying to be invisible." He glanced at me, his eyes reflecting the dashboard lights. "Helen used to say that the strongest people she knew were those who had been broken and chose to rebuild themselves anyway. I think she would have admired you greatly, Octavia." It was the first time he had used my real name, though I had shared it with him weeks earlier. Hearing it spoken with such respect, such tenderness, helped steady me for what lay ahead. The hotel suite Fletcher had arranged was elegant but anonymous, with security posted discreetly in the hallway. Catherine Lowell arrived precisely on time, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and piercing eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Bellamy," she greeted me with a firm handshake. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. I want to be clear from the outset. I'm not here to sensationalize your trauma. I'm here to ensure your voice is heard accurately and completely." Her professionalism calmed my nerves. We spent 6 hours together, the interview occasionally pausing when my emotions overwhelmed me or when Fletcher needed to clarify legal points. Catherine was thorough but compassionate, pushing for details when needed but recognizing when I needed breaks. We covered everything, from the early days of my marriage when Sterling's control had seemed like protection, to the gradual isolation from friends and family, to the financial manipulation, to the escalating physical abuse that culminated in him pushing me down the stairs. I shared medical records, photographs of injuries, witness statements Fletcher had gathered from former household staff. "Why now?" Catherine asked toward the end. "After 40 years, what finally made you leave?" I considered the question carefully. When I was lying at the bottom of those stairs, looking up at Sterling watching me with such cold calculation, I realized he would eventually succeed in killing me, and I thought about all the women who never get the chance to escape, who die before they can find freedom. I decided I wouldn't be one of them. Catherine nodded, jotting a final note. "Mrs. Bellamy, in your own words, what do you want people to understand about your situation? That abuse doesn't always look like the stereotypes. That wealthy, educated, respectable men can be monsters behind closed doors. That it's never too late to reclaim your life." I paused, finding the words that had been forming in my heart for months. And that surviving isn't just about escaping. It's about rebuilding yourself from the fragments they leave behind. The interview aired 3 days later. By then, I had returned to Harborview, to my cottage and my one-eyed cat, to the community that had embraced Eleanor Winters without knowing Octavia Bellamy. I watched the broadcast with Maeve and Thaddeus, my hands clutched tightly in theirs as my story unfolded on screen. Catherine had done an exceptional job, presenting the evidence methodically while capturing the emotional reality of living under Sterling's control. She had included statements from domestic violence experts explaining the psychology of long-term abuse, the barriers to leaving, the financial entrapment that keeps women in dangerous marriages. Most powerfully, she had included a brief statement from Zara, her face partially obscured, but her voice clear. "I'm still processing what I've learned about my father and my childhood, but I believe my mother, and I support her right to safety and dignity after everything she's endured." Those words, more than anything else in the interview, broke the dam of emotions I had been holding back. I sobbed in Maeve's arms while Thaddeus quietly kept watch at the window, alert for any sign of threat. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Justice for Octavia began trending on social media. Women's advocacy groups issued statements of support. Sterling's business associates scrambled to distance themselves further, his remaining defenders suddenly silent. Sterling himself issued a terse statement claiming the interview was full of fabrications and that he would address these defamatory claims in court. But the power of his denial had diminished considerably. The Sterling Bellamy, who had seemed invincible for 40 years now, appeared diminished, desperate, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. The SEC investigation accelerated, with agents now examining connections between Sterling's financial crimes and his efforts to control and isolate me. The divorce proceedings moved forward, with the court freezing most of Sterling's assets pending resolution of both the divorce and the federal investigation. I knew the battle was far from over. Sterling would fight to the bitter end, using every resource and connection at his disposal. But for the first time, I believed I might actually win. Not just my freedom and financial security, but the right to define my own story. As the media frenzy continued in the days following the interview, I received an unexpected call from Fletcher. "Octavia," his voice was urgent. "Sterling's gone missing." "What do you mean, missing?" I gripped the phone tighter, unsure whether to feel relief or heightened fear. "He didn't appear for a scheduled deposition yesterday. His attorney couldn't reach him. His housekeeper reports he hasn't been home in 3 days. His passport is gone." Fletcher's voice was tense. "The FBI has been notified because of the pending SEC charges, but you need to be on high alert. If he's fled the country, that's one thing. If he's coming after you..." The implication hung in the air between us. Sterling, cornered and desperate, might decide that if he was going down, he would take me with him. "I'll increase security immediately," Fletcher continued. "Don't go anywhere alone. Consider relocating temporarily until he's found." I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. Sterling's disappearance changed everything. If he had fled to avoid prosecution, it was a tacit admission of guilt that strengthened my case enormously. But if he was in wind with nothing left to lose, I was in more danger than ever before. I called Maeve and explained the situation. Without hesitation, she insisted I stay with her rather than alone at my cottage. "My house has a security system and a very loud dog," she pointed out. "And Sterling doesn't know about our connection." Thaddeus insisted on taking shifts, watching the house with 2 other men from town, a retired police officer and a former military medic who had become part of our small but fiercely protective community. Harborview was closing ranks around me. These people who had first embraced Eleanor Winters, now extending that same protection to Octavia Bellamy. 3 tense days passed with no sign of Sterling and no further information about his whereabouts. I moved carefully between Maeve's house and the bookstore, always accompanied, always watchful. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares of Sterling emerging from shadows, pushing me down endless staircases. On the 4th day, Fletcher called again. "They've traced Sterling's movements to Montreal," he reported. "He used his credit card at a hotel there 2 days ago, then disappeared again. The working theory is that he's trying to reach a country without extradition." The news should have been reassuring, Sterling fleeing rather than coming after me, but something felt wrong. It was too obvious, too easily traced for a man who prided himself on strategic thinking. Sterling would never leave such a clear trail unless he wanted to be followed. I shared my concerns with Fletcher, who promised to relay them to the federal investigators. But I could hear the skepticism in his voice. From his perspective, Sterling was making a predictable move for a wealthy criminal facing prosecution, running to a place where American justice couldn't reach him. Later that afternoon, as I helped Maeve inventory new stock in the bookstore's back room, my burner phone rang, Zara's number. "He contacted me," she said without preamble, her voice tight with stress. "Dad called from a number I didn't recognize. He sounded different, calm, almost peaceful. He asked about you." My blood ran cold. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific. I said I'd spoken to you but didn't know where you were staying. He said that was okay, that he just wanted to make things right before he left." "Left for where?" "He wouldn't say. But Mom," Zara's voice dropped to a whisper, "he said to tell you he was sorry about the stairs, that he never meant for it to go that far." It sounded like a goodbye. The hair on my arm stood up. In 40 years of marriage, I had never once heard Sterling Bellamy apologize for anything. He didn't believe in remorse. He believed in power and consequences. An apology now, when he was cornered and desperate, could only mean one thing. He was planning something drastic. "Zara, listen to me carefully. I want you to go somewhere public right now, a coffee shop, a library, anywhere with witnesses. Stay there until I call you back. Don't go home. Don't contact your father again." "Mom, you're scaring me." "Please, just do as I ask. I'll explain everything soon." I ended the call and immediately dialed Fletcher, relaying the conversation and my fears. "I agree it's concerning," he said, after a moment of consideration. "Sterling doesn't do remorse. I'll contact the FBI again, but in the meantime, we should move you immediately. If he contacted Zara, he might be trying to find you through her." I hung up and turned to Maeve, who had heard enough of my side of the conversation to understand the situation had escalated. "We need to leave," I said simply. She nodded, already reaching for her coat. "My sister's place in Portland. He doesn't know about her." We were halfway to the door when my phone chimed with a text message. Unknown number. My finger trembled as I opened it. "Look outside, Octavia." I froze, then moved cautiously to the storefront window. Across the street, leaning against a parked car, was Sterling. He looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, his usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. When our eyes met, he smiled. Not his public smile, charming and magnetic, but the cold, private smile I knew all too well. He held up his phone, typed something, and my phone chimed again. "Just a conversation. That's all I want. No one needs to get hurt." Maeve had joined me at the window. "Is that him?" she asked, her voice low and steady. I nodded, unable to speak past the knot of fear in my throat. "I'm calling the police," she said, reaching for the store phone. "No." I caught her arm. "He'll be gone before they arrive, and then we won't know where he is or what he's planning." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I need to talk to him." "Absolutely not." Maeve's grip on my arm tightened. "That man tried to kill you, and he might try again if I don't hear what he has to say." I met her concerned gaze. "Text Thaddeus and the others. Tell them to come, but stay out of sight. And call Fletcher. He can alert the FBI that Sterling's here." Before she could protest further, I typed a response. "The diner 2 blocks south, public place, 10 minutes. Sterling read the message, nodded once, and walked away in the direction of the diner. "This is insane," Maeve said as she sent the texts I'd requested. "At least let me come with you." I shook my head. Sterling is unpredictable when cornered. I don't want anyone else in the crossfire. I squeezed her hand. "I've spent 40 years being afraid of this man. I'm done running." The walk to the diner was the longest 2 blocks of my life. My hip ached with each step, a physical reminder of what Sterling was capable of. But alongside the fear was something new, a steely resolve. I was not the same woman who had fallen down those stairs. I was not his victim anymore. The diner was busy with the late afternoon crowd, which gave me some comfort. Sterling had chosen a booth in the back corner, facing the door, always positioning himself to control the space, to monitor exits and entrances. Some habits never changed. He stood as I approached, a reflexive display of manners that seemed absurd given our circumstances. I slid into the booth across from him, careful to maintain distance, my phone on the table with Fletcher's number ready to dial. Up close, the changes in Sterling were more apparent. He had aged years in the months since I'd left. Deep lines etched around his mouth, dark circles under his eyes. His hands, always his most expressive feature, trembled slightly as he clasped them on the table. "You look well, Octavia," he said, his voice carrying the same smooth cadence I'd once found so attractive. "Freedom suits you. What do you want, Sterling?" I kept my voice level, refusing to be drawn into small talk. He studied me for a long moment. "You've changed. There's a clarity in your eyes that wasn't there before. Near-death experiences tend to provide perspective. A flash of something, anger, regret, crossed his face before he controlled it. I suppose I deserve that. You deserve a lot more than that. You're facing federal charges, civil lawsuits, and potentially attempted murder charges. So I'll ask again, what do you want?" Sterling sighed, suddenly looking every day of his 65 years. "To explain myself, I suppose, though I realize how inadequate any explanation must seem. Try me." He glanced around the diner, then leaned forward slightly. "I never intended to kill you that night. I was angry, yes. You'd discovered things I'd kept hidden for years. But pushing you—" He shook his head. "It was impulse, not premeditation." "And that makes it better?" I asked incredulously. "No, nothing makes it better." For the first time in our conversation, he met my eyes directly. "I've lost everything, Octavia. My reputation, my freedom, my daughter. The life I spent decades building is gone. You destroyed it yourself. Every lie, every manipulation, every act of violence, those were your choices." "Yes." The simple admission shocked me more than any denial could have. I've had a lot of time to think since you left, about the kind of man I've been, the kind of husband, father. He paused. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and you don't owe it to me. Then what are you asking for? Sterling reached slowly into his jacket pocket. I tensed, but he merely withdrew an envelope and placed it on the table between us. Inside is documentation of all my remaining assets, the ones the SEC hasn't frozen yet. Offshore accounts, bearer bonds, physical assets. I've signed everything over to you and Zara. He pushed the envelope toward me. It won't undo the damage I've caused, but it might help you both build something new. I stared at the envelope, suspicion overriding any other reaction. Why would you do this? Because I'm dying, Octavia. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama or bid for sympathy. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. I've known for 6 months. The revelation landed like a physical blow. I searched his face for signs of deception, but found only a weary resignation that I had never seen in him before. The Montreal trip wasn't about fleeing prosecution, he continued. It was to consult with a specialist for a last-ditch treatment option. They confirmed what I already knew. There's nothing to be done except manage the pain for the time I have left. How long? The question escaped before I could stop it. Weeks. A month at most. I sat back, processing this unexpected turn. Part of me wondered if this was another manipulation, a ploy for sympathy or leniency. But there was a hollowness to Sterling's appearance that couldn't be faked, a yellowing tinge to his skin that I recognized from my own father's battle with liver cancer years ago. The FBI is looking for you, I said finally. You're a fugitive. Sterling nodded. I know. I'll turn myself in after our conversation. I just needed to see you first, to give you this. He gestured to the envelope, and to say that you were right to leave, right to expose what I'd done. I should have been the man you deserved all those years ago. It was the closest thing to genuine remorse I had ever heard from Sterling Bellamy. Not excuses, not justifications, just acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. It didn't heal the wounds or erase the trauma, but it was something. I don't know what to say, I admitted. You don't need to say anything. I didn't come for absolution. Sterling glanced at his watch, then stood carefully. The FBI will be here soon, I imagine. Your lawyer would have alerted them the moment you told him I was in town. I remained seated, watching him warily. That's it? You're just going to turn yourself in? What other choice do I have? Run for a few more weeks until the cancer takes me? Hide like a criminal and die alone in some anonymous hotel room? He shook his head. I've made my peace with how this ends, Octavia. As he turned to leave, I found myself asking the question that had haunted me for months. Why did you do it, Sterling? All of it. The control, the isolation, the abuse. What did it give you that love and partnership couldn't have? He paused, considering the question with what seemed like genuine reflection. I think I was terrified of losing control, of being vulnerable, of needing someone who might leave me. A sad smile crossed his face. Ironic that in trying to prevent that fear, I created exactly the outcome I dreaded most. With that, he walked out of the diner, his once commanding presence diminished by illness and defeat. Through the window, I watched as he stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, face tilted up to the pale winter sun. He looked almost peaceful. Moments later, 2 unmarked cars pulled up. Men in suits approached Sterling, who offered his wrists without resistance. As they led him to one of the vehicles, he glanced back at the diner, his eyes finding mine through the glass. He gave a small nod, not in triumph or defiance, but in something that looked almost like acceptance. I remained at the booth long after they had driven away, the envelope untouched on the table before me. My phone buzzed repeatedly. Fletcher, Maeve, Thaddeus, all concerned about my safety. But I needed this moment of solitude to process what had just occurred. Sterling was dying. The man who had dominated my existence for 4 decades would soon be gone from this world. There would be no protracted legal battle, no years of looking over my shoulder, just the natural conclusion that awaits us all. I felt no joy at the news, no vindictive satisfaction. Instead, there was a complex tangle of emotions, relief, sadness for what might have been, and most surprisingly, a sense of closure that I had never expected to find. When I finally left the diner, Thaddeus was waiting outside, his weathered face lined with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked simply. "No," I answered honestly, "but I think I will be." The weeks that followed brought rapid changes. True to his word, Sterling formally confessed to the financial crimes, providing prosecutors with detailed information about his business dealings in exchange for assurances that the funds he had transferred to Zara and me would not be seized as ill-gotten gains. He was placed under house arrest given his terminal condition, with round-the-clock monitoring and regular medical care. Zara visited him daily as his condition deteriorated. I did not. Whatever peace Sterling and I had reached in that diner was sufficient. I had no desire to watch his decline or participate in deathbed reconciliations. My focus was on rebuilding, not revisiting. Fletcher confirmed that the documentation Sterling had provided was legitimate. Between those hidden assets and what would eventually be released from the frozen accounts once the legal proceedings concluded, Zara and I would have financial security for the rest of our lives. I established a foundation in my own name, not Bellamy, but Reed, reclaiming my original identity. The foundation would provide resources and support for older women escaping domestic violence, addressing the unique challenges faced by those who had spent decades in abusive relationships. Sterling Bellamy died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with Zara at his bedside. She called me afterward, her voice thick with conflicted emotions. "He asked me to tell you something," she said. His last coherent words. He said, "Tell your mother she was always stronger than I was, strong enough to leave, strong enough to rebuild. I hope she never stops." I thanked Zara for relaying the message, unsure how to process this final communication. It wasn't quite an apology, wasn't quite praise. Like so much with Sterling, it existed in a morally ambiguous space that left me to determine its meaning. The funeral was small, attended primarily by business associates rather than friends. I did not go. Zara understood my absence was not a rejection of her grief, but a necessary boundary for my healing. Afterward, she came to Harborview, spending a week with me in the cottage that had become my true home. We walked along the harbor each morning, rebuilding our relationship one conversation at a time. She shared memories of her childhood that I had missed or perceived differently, and I filled in the gaps of my own experience without demonizing the father she was still mourning. It was delicate, sometimes painful work, but essential for both of us. On her last night in town, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset over the water, Zara asked the question I had been anticipating. "Will you come back to Connecticut now? The house is yours legally. There's nothing keeping you away anymore." I considered the question carefully. "No," I said finally. "That house was never really my home. It was a beautiful prison. I found something here that I never had there, a life that's truly mine." Zara nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You seem complete here, like you found all the pieces of yourself that got lost along the way." "Not all of them," I smiled, taking her hand. "Some of the most important pieces are sitting right here." In the year since Sterling's death, life has settled into new patterns. I officially changed my name back to Octavia Reed, merging my past and present identities. I purchased the cottage outright, along with Tidewater books, when Maeve decided to retire. My relationship with Thaddeus evolved gradually from friendship to companionship to a gentle love that neither of us had expected to find at our age. Zara visits monthly, sometimes bringing her new boyfriend, a kind archaeology professor who treats her with the respect Sterling never showed me. She has begun therapy to process the complex legacy of her father and to break the patterns she unconsciously absorbed growing up in our household. I am profoundly proud of her courage and self-awareness. The Foundation's work has become my passion. We've helped dozens of women over 60 escape abusive situations, providing financial support, legal guidance, and perhaps most importantly, hope that it's never too late to reclaim one's life. Each success story heals another fragment of my own past. Some nights, I still dream of falling down those stairs. But now, in my dreams, I get up at the bottom. I look up at Sterling and see not a looming threat, but a diminished figure, pitiable in his need to control and dominate. And then I walk away, toward the light, toward freedom. I am 64 years old. My hip aches when it rains. My hands show the fine creases of age. My heart bears scars that will never fully heal. But I am alive in ways I never was during those 40 years of marriage. I wake each morning grateful for the second chance that began with a terrible fall and the strength to finally get up and walk away. Sterling was right about one thing. I was stronger than he was, strong enough to leave, strong enough to rebuild, strong enough to find joy and purpose in the years I have left. And I have no intention of stopping. If you're watching this and my story resonates with you, please remember it's never too late to start over. Your past doesn't define your future. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more of my journey and to join our community of survivors who are thriving, not just surviving.